On behalf of CPE, Bay Resistance, Arab Resource and Organizing Center, and the Anti-Police Terror Project, welcome back to Palestine Solidarity Announcements. If you're new to PSAs, these calls are a space for us to provide weekly updates on what's happening in Palestine, the most recent calls to action, and ways you can join in ongoing solidarity work. If you're returning, thanks for sticking with us. Please share these calls with your comrades, colleagues, and friends. And the recordings are available on CPE's YouTube channel, and also we are now available as a podcast on Spotify. Um, Welcome back again to Friday PSAs. This is the recording of our show on September 27th, 2024. Just this morning, amidst nonstop protests this week in New York City, outside of the UN, war criminal and genocider Benjamin Netanyahu spoke at the 79th session of the UN General Assembly. Before his address, Israel bombed an entire neighborhood in Beirut, flattening multi-story apartment buildings and likely killing scores, if not hundreds, of Lebanese people. That bombing continues, with fresh reports coming out of Lebanon as we speak. Then, as Netanyahu took to the podium this morning, what appeared to be the delegates from most of the UN member states walked out, leaving a nearly empty United Nations hall. Among the typical mendacious things we've come to expect from Netanyahu, he claimed that Hezbollah has placed rockets and missiles in every kitchen and garage in Lebanon, while calling the UN an, quote, anti-Semitic swamp and a, quote, anti-Israel flat earth society. It's now well documented, as it was in the early months of the genocide in Gaza, that Netanyahu and other members of the Zionist political machine are on record uttering every possible vile explanation and expression of genocidal intent towards the Lebanese people, including, for example, statements by Israel's education minister that, quote, Lebanon will be annihilated, or another Israeli minister calling for the ethnic cleansing of the, quote, hostile Shiite population to create a, quote, buffer zone free from the enemy population. It is incredible that just a short time after one of the most earth-shattering mass maiming terrorist attacks in global history, i.e. the mass bombing of pagers across Lebanon, we are now on the verge of a ground invasion into Lebanon by Israel. As journalist Lara Bitar in Beirut noted, quote, Israel's genocide playbook is now being applied to Lebanon. One, inform residents they need to evacuate for their safety, and two, bomb roads, bridges, and freeways they need to use to flee an indiscriminate bombing campaign. We're only 1 week from the 1-year anniversary of the start of the genocide in Gaza on October 7th, and we're already seeing mass anti-war mobilizations from San Francisco to New York City in response to what's happening in Lebanon. Despite all the warnings and efforts of the international community and the anti-war movements and the Palestine Solidarity Movement, we are witnessing war, out of control and with no end in sight. To make sense of some of what's happening right now, and to help us get through this analysis, we'll have Samer Arabi from Iraq. And first, let's start with Melissa Fan to ground us in a semantics exercise. Thanks again for joining us, and Melissa, welcome back.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. As we are simultaneously witnessing Israel expanding their campaign of terror in Lebanon and approaching the 1-year anniversary of October 7th, marking a day of both incredible bravery and resistance by the Palestinian people, and the escalation of the continuing genocide in Palestine, I myself have been feeling overwhelming waves of grief wash over me, bubbling up just underneath my skin at all hours of the day. Part of this grief being made up by feelings of burning rage and continual refusal to accept that this is the world we live in. And I know I'm not alone in these feelings, because it is precisely this rage for injustice and the refusal to accept the mass suffering in the world that drives us to act in the name of liberation. And yet, a paradox lives here. Because this type of rage and refusal is an unsustainable state of being. It can easily eat us up from the inside out, turning us into bitter people, ineffective comrades, affecting the relationships which are the bread and butter of liberation. So here is the question and practice for today. How do we hold and channel these internal feelings of rage and refusal into just and loving action? Finding yourself now in your body, just as you are. Noticing what is without trying to shift. What sensations exist in your body? If the grief is close to your skin, like it is for me, maybe some of that just wanting to come up and out. Maybe it's the survival mechanism of numbness, of dissociation. Simply noticing and beginning to turn your conscious awareness to your breath. Feeling your rib cage expand and contract. Noticing the edges of your body going all the way down to your feet. Giving yourself a little tap on your feet if you need to, or maybe wiggling your toes. And going all the way up your body, through your spine, to the top of your head. And once again here, giving yourself a little tap if you need to. And as you're here, simply noticing the sensations of your body, I invite you to recall the sensations of rage, of righteous rage. This rage, which is intertwined with refusal to accept the world as it is, the injustices of the world. How do you notice this feeling? Where in your body is it located? Does it have a shape, a texture, a color, a movement? And simultaneously, as you're noticing this, beginning to invite just a kernel or maybe a wave of love into your body. And what is that like when these forces interact with each other? How does it change both, if it changes at all? And continuing to take some deep breaths. I invite you to imagine maybe an arrow or a dam, some way to imagine an outlet for this energy, for this rage, for this injustice. You don't have to have the answer right now. It's something that you can meditate on. Just calling to your body, calling to your sensation, to your heart. What is it like for you to channel these feelings into action, out of your body? Thank you for practicing with me today.
Melissa, thank you so much as usual for grounding us. Samer, it's good to have you back. I'm always grateful for the analysis you bring us, comrade. I'm especially grateful this week for two reasons. One, we are reaching a tipping point on something we've been following for months, which is this tension between Hezbollah and Israel, and it looks like we are now shifting into war footing there. And second, because I know that you are laboring a little bit under the weather, and so we are really grateful that you've been able to manage through a difficult week of illness and still show up for us. We're always grateful for that. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot to talk about today about this shift in position, some really difficult and somber news in Lebanon. I think you will talk about the deadliest day in Lebanese history in many decades, and also at the same time, still a lot going on the ground in Rafah and in Khan Yunis. And so, some of the tension here over the next couple weeks and months will be how we keep track of these things and how they impact and play off of each other. So, again, grateful to have you and looking forward to your analysis today.
Thanks, Thomas. It's good to be back. And yeah, apologies. I've got a little bit of a COVID brain, so I'm gonna do my best to be coherent, but might not always succeed. I appreciate your grace. Um, it has been a heck of a week. There's a lot going on, of course. Um, and I think it's been hard to maintain a focus on Palestine, given everything that's been happening in Lebanon. But of course, there's a lot for us to consider in both places, frankly, and the way that a lot of that overlaps. And also in ways that, and we'll come to this later, that what we've learned from watching how Israel operates in Palestine over the last year tells us a lot about what it's about to do in Lebanon. So we'll get into all of that, of course. But first, we'll go through what's been happening in Gaza, starting at the southern tip and working our way up. Uh, there isn't a whole lot to report on Rafah, other than, 2 weeks after the IDF declared victory in Rafah, the fighting continues to be very, very heated. There was a video that was put out of a Hamas ambush of Israeli supply lines that destroyed like a tank and a series of other armored vehicles. So, Israeli control over Rafah continues to be largely non-existent. Khan Yunis is probably where the biggest news in Gaza of the week came through uh, this week. You know, in addition to a series of additional airstrikes for the I don't know how many, the upteenth time now, uh, a lorry, like a truck carrying 88 unidentified and unidentifiable Palestinian bodies was dropped off in Khan Yunis again this week. This is a thing we've talked about in previous PSAs several times over the course of the past year, where Israel will literally just bring in a truck full of dead bodies without any explanation on who they are or how they died or why they're there. And this time, the hospital in Khan Yunis basically refused to take the bodies until Israel provided some sort of explanation for who they are or why they were being dropped off like this. That didn't end up happening, but it did at least raise some headlines in a way that it often doesn't historically. So not nothing, but the fact that it continues to do that, you don't need me to tell you this is in direct contravention to the rules of war and international humanitarian law. Like, the way that competing military forces are supposed to handle the dead is very strictly laid out. And of course, it's not this whatever horror show this is. Um, in Gaza City, a really horrific bombing of another school that killed a bunch of children, a pregnant woman, and a group of other people in Gaza City was probably the biggest news out of Gaza City this past week. But The other big thing to note is just that the plan for the displacement of northern Gaza that we talked about last week, for those of you who were here, seems to be continuing. So the so-called generals plan, that would within a period of 1 week displace 300,000 Palestinians out of northern Gaza to basically empty it of its entire population as a so-called uh, Hamas containment plan. Um, is not fully enacted yet. It's hard to know whether it will actually be a thing or not, but the fact that the Israeli military at its highest levels are talking about how they're considering this plan and that home demolitions across Gaza City are continuing fairly unabated, I think tells us a lot about the very real possibility that this is going to happen. And of course, this is sort of the end game in a lot of ways for Israel's invasion and genocide in Gaza, which is, ethnic cleansing of the population and then reclaiming the territory, which has been a overt objective by a significant portion of the Israeli cabinet. So we shouldn't be surprised if it does happen, but right now it is still largely a plan. Um, in the West Bank, the shutting down of Al Jazeera's office again. This comes after the East Jerusalem branch of Al Jazeera was shut down rather violently back in May. Now the bureau in Ramallah has been shut down, and Al Jazeera has been ordered to stop broadcasting for 45 days. And yeah, of course, it's not just the fact that the media office is shuttered, but it's the way that it's done. Like the Israeli government could easily just issue a statement and put it on their door, but instead they send armed troops into the office, just to harass and terrify the journalists, um, which is not particularly surprising, but excuse me, it does tell us, like it's meant to be a sort of PR stunt, right? And of course, is meant to terrorize journalists, which has been an ongoing effort to reduce journalists' ability to cover what Israel is doing, both in Palestine and in Lebanon. The other small West Bank news update is just that the assassination of Ayşenur Ezgi Egi, the um, Seattle Seattle woman who was assassinated by an IDF sniper in the West Bank a few weeks ago. Adam Smith, the representative of her district, along with 102 of his colleagues in the House, all Democrats, incidentally, are calling for an independent investigation into what they're calling a potential homicide, which like it was very, very clearly was. And notes in here to walk away without asking further questions gives Israeli forces unacceptable license to act with impunity. That's coming from Adam Smith, a pretty shockingly strong statement. Adam Smith somewhat infamously referred to campus protests as left-wing totalitarianism. This is a Democrat, mind you, who basically said that people protesting the genocide in Gaza are totalitarians, serving like foreign masters. So the usual sort of Zionist talking point nonsense. So for even him to come around in that way is not nothing. I think it's something that's definitely worth noting, along with the fact that 102 colleagues are directly calling out Israeli impunity is a step. So that was my quick overview of the things happening in Palestine. Um, I did want to spend most of my time today talking about Lebanon just because it's been a really big week of developments there. Uh, it's been horrific. I'm sure folks have seen all of the violence and devastation and death that Israel has caused just in the past week. The sort of natural endpoint of the escalation that we've been seeing for the past few months. I think we talked back in January or February about a leaked IDF plan to commence the ground invasion of Lebanon in September. And here we are in September, and it's looking like more likely than it ever has. So it's also, I feel like, worth reflecting on the fact that this was a plan that was leaked 6 months ago. So I think the media generally tends to try to portray this as a sort of organic escalation of things that it just sort of happened over this past week. But no, this is something that Israel has clearly been planning for a really, really long time. And the nature of the strikes and the nature of its attacks, I think, really point to a very systemic attempt uh, to accomplish the things that it wants to accomplish in Lebanon. And we'll talk a little bit about what I think those things might be. But the level of violence here is really something. And I think, we've all become a little bit numb to the amount of death that Israel is causing every single day. But I thought this chart really did a good job of showing just how nuts that first day of bombing was, where 558 people were killed, which is 6 times more than the deadliest day in the 2006 war in Lebanon. And I happened to be in Lebanon for that 2006 war, and it was like the death and devastation I saw then was really absolutely overwhelming. And the thought that this is 6 times higher is really just sort of it breaks your brain a little bit. Um, it is, I think, very clearly the latest example of a thing that we've talked about many times on these PSAs, which is Israel's Dahieh doctrine, specifically named for the Beirut suburb that Israel just annihilated again. And the idea underlying the Dahieh doctrine, as we've talked about several times, is that rather than target Hezbollah directly, the goal is just to inflict as widespread of damage and devastation as possible in the hopes that that sort of broad violence causes the population itself to turn against Hezbollah. It's never worked. It's not really working right now, but it's very clear that that's the intention here. You see them destroying giant apartment blocks and high rises, hospitals and schools, the sort of usual playbook. And in fact, I think in a lot of ways, what we're seeing is the exact same playbook that we saw in Gaza, like almost to a comic degree. First you see the sort of right-wing members of the cabinet talking about annihilating the country and annexing the country. You can see here statements from on the left, the Israeli Minister of Education, of all people, talking about how how Lebanon will be annihilated and cease to exist. On the right is a Google translated uh, tweet from the Minister of Diaspora Affairs, I think, Amichai Chikli, talking about how the only solution to the situation they're in is for Israel to annex all the territory in Lebanon south of the Litani River, which is a thing that like hard right Israelis have been talking about for many, many, many years. The idea that the stated goal of Netanyahu in this war is that Hezbollah has to withdraw to north of the Litani River, and that's that. For folks who can see the slide, there's this blue line that meanders through Lebanon, and that's the Litani River. And a call for a demilitarized zone between those is the sort of Netanyahu talking point, and then the far right ministers in this cabinet are saying annex it. It's not really, frankly, that different in practice, but the idea underlying it, I think, is quite similar. So you have the sort of like genocidal rhetoric about, destroying the country and annexing its territory. You have the casting doubt on the death toll stuff. You're already seeing the phrase Hezbollah run health ministry in reference to the number of people dying in Lebanon, again, as an attempt to sort of cast doubt on the number of civilians that Israel is killing. You're seeing the same discourse around human shields, where Netanyahu is very explicitly saying that the civilians who are dying in Lebanon are dying because Hamas is using them as human shields. There is, I'm sure everybody here knows this, but there's zero evidence of that actually happening. The fact that Hezbollah exists within a society does not mean that everybody else who lives in that society is a human shield. I think it's very telling that one of the responses from Hezbollah this past week was firing a ballistic missile at Tel Aviv, which everybody considers to be, the Western world really condemned as an act of terrorism. Despite the fact that they were aiming it at an IDF compound, but that IDF compound happens to be in the middle of a population center, but no one calls that using human shields, right? And I did want to draw folks' attention to this Mondoweiss article that I think does a really good job of showing the sort of double standard that Israel uses around the discourse on human shields, where The IDF actually literally does use human shields. So this idea of, a military base in a population center isn't actually human shields. Literally, basically every country on Earth does this. Uh, but Israel like literally ties Palestinian civilians to the front of their trucks so that if someone tried to attack the truck, they would kill that Palestinian first. So that's literally a human shield. And this is a ongoing court battle within Israel about their right to do this. So the idea that, them accusing other people of using human shields is, laughable at best, but obviously is meant to just be a justification for the high civilian death toll. And then, right, we're following the Palestine playbook now. We've already got the, you know, um, Hezbollah run health ministry. We have the use of human shields. We have the right wingers calling for the annihilation of the whole country. And now we have the ceasefire negotiations where, the US and France and a series of other countries put together a plan for a temporary cessation of hostilities. I think a 21-day ceasefire that, according to US and French officials, was negotiated with Netanyahu himself directly. And as soon as that plan went public, Netanyahu rejected it. So, like, obviously, no actual interest in a ceasefire. Um, yeah, I think the Israeli Prime Minister's office put out a statement saying that the ceasefire plan was an American-French proposal that the Prime Minister didn't even respond to, while the French ambassador was like, he negotiated it with us. He already said that he was okay with it. And instead of agreeing to any sort of ceasefire, Netanyahu is using the same sort of language that he was using in Palestine about not stopping until we achieve all of our goals, which of course are not realistic and not conceivable goals. So the US, finding itself frustrated that Netanyahu rejects the ceasefire that they planned together, of course, reacts to that frustration by sending more military aid and by sending more troops. So, we saw, I think, on Thursday that Israel announced that it got another $9 billion US military aid package. This is mostly uh, aerial defense money to replenish the Iron Dome and David Sling, but, a series of other things as well. I thought it was interesting that the only news about this came from an Israeli announcement as opposed to like a Biden administration disclosure or whatnot, which I think is saying something about the way that Israel is trying to play this PR game to show that there is no daylight between them and the United States, despite the condemnations that they're receiving. So the fact that that's happening is, unsurprising, but the deployment of U.S. troops, I would say, is the thing that's really worrying. And, as we consider the possibility of this violence in Lebanon sort of escalating into the dreaded regional war, it's hard not to see this as a really big step in that direction. I was waiting to see when we would get more information on what types of troops the United States was sending. There's different ways that the United States sends troops, and they mean very different things. It's often the case that the US sends army reserves to places, and that just, it's a sort of gesture of support, but it doesn't really mean anything. It's not like the army reserves are really capable of engaging in like heavy combat, but that's not what happened this time. They sent like a US airborne division, which is bad, right? Like you send like active combat troops with the expectation that they'll be engaged in active combat. So the fact that that's where we're at in terms of the U.S. support for Israel's, new genocidal assault is a really bad sign. It's a really, really bad sign. And I think the impunity that you see with that is what allows then Israel to do things like, just a few hours ago, flatten a series of high-rise apartment buildings, ostensibly to target Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. This just happened, so folks on the call actually might know more than I do about this. As far as I've heard, there are mixed reports on whether Nasrallah was actually hit in the strike. A lot of outlets reported that he was not, but some of those stories have since been deleted, so I don't really know anymore what's happening with that, but I imagine we'll find out in the coming days. Um, So uh, the last thing that I just wanted to reflect on quickly in this whole Lebanon story is just that it's still not super clear, I think, where it goes from here. I know that I already mentioned that this plan for a ground invasion in September, but I'm still not 100% sure that that is in fact what's going to happen. I'd say odds are in that direction, but the fact that Israeli military officials have been saying the ground invasion is coming is actually a sign that maybe it's not. Again, you don't generally broadcast the thing you're going to do before you do it. They would have just invaded instead of, putting out a series of press releases saying we're about to invade. But they might. It's really hard to say. It depends on what the goal of the Israeli government is vis-a-vis this conflict. I think there are two very different goals here. One would be um, a decisive military campaign that actually knocks out Hezbollah, which, if that is their goal, will require a ground invasion. These airstrikes are horrific. They're horrifying to see. The damage and death and destruction that they cause are really hard to sort of wrap your head around. But you can't defeat an armed force with airstrikes. That's just like not how it works. Like particularly for an organization like Hezbollah, which is literally designed around the idea that Israeli airstrikes are a thing that they have to consider. So like most of their infrastructure is underground. Um, so if that is the case, then there has to be a ground invasion, right? There's no other way to actually defeat Hezbollah without a ground invasion. Um, to do so will incur heavy losses, I think, for the IDF without a question, and like how that actually plays out, I think, is anybody's guess. But I will probably know in the next week or two whether they're actually going to send troops in. Every assessment, including by the Israeli military and the U.S. military, says that if Israel sends U.S. troops into Lebanon, it's going to be an absolute disaster for Israel. But if they know that and they're doing it anyway, they may know something that we don't know. So that's one trajectory that I think we need to keep in mind. The other is that it's not about that. It's a PR fight, right? Like they're doing the bombings to look big and tough and strong, to shore up support with the right wing base, to show that they can um, cause all this death and destruction at a moment's notice, but stop there, right? So a way of just like distracting attention from Palestine or the stuff that's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank, frankly, to sort of reset the narrative, to maybe like, draw the US troops in and whatever. But that is a very different game than a ground invasion. So it may be one or the other, maybe a little bit of both, but I think we'll know more in the coming weeks. If I had to guess, I don't know. I don't even know why I said that because I'd really rather not guess. I think a ground invasion is more likely than not. But I think, yeah, I definitely think that we'll know more this time next week or definitely the week after that. And then zooming back out a little bit, incredible investigative research this week by ProPublica about US uh, US offices that were conducting investigations on whether Israeli weapons transfers were used for war crimes showed that um, Secretary of State Antony Blinken received reports from both USAID and the State Department Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration saying that, yes, definitively, Israel is committing war crimes with US weapons. And, like their big thing was that humanitarian aid was definitely purposely being blocked by the IDF in Gaza. And for humanitarian aid to be blocked by a country that's receiving U.S. weapons shipments, by U.S. law requires those weapon shipments to cease. And so that information was given to Blinken, and then days later, he put out a statement, a very like tortured sentence that says, "We do not currently assess that the Israeli government is prohibiting or otherwise restricting the transport or delivery of U.S. humanitarian assistance," despite the fact that the people who did the research told him the exact opposite thing. So if you've been seeing some petitions and calls for Antony Blinken to resign, it's because of this. He won't, but I think it's good to put pressure on him nonetheless. Like it's just such a craven act. It's remarkable how Antony Blinken, like, you just think he can't get any worse, and he continues to get worse. On the other side of the arms embargo story is the Bernie Sanders resolution that I think is now on the House floor or the Senate floor, sorry, that will block U.S. arms sales to Israel. It's a resolution with I think three co-sponsors, and they're not even like the hard lefties. So that's saying something. I included the language of the proposal in the links if folks want to take a look. It's a good resolution. It's got within it a page that goes through um, like a record of verified war crimes that Israel has committed using U.S. weapons. So that will, I don't think it's gone for a vote yet. I'm actually not sure. I'm sorry, but I think it's coming soonish. Um, for this resolution to successfully stop weapons shipments to Israel, it has to pass the Senate. Once it passes the Senate, it's got to go to the House, which is Republican run. It's got to pass the House, and then Biden has to not veto it. I think it's very unlikely for any of those three things to happen. It's not going to pass the Senate. It definitely wouldn't pass the House, and Biden would for sure veto it. So, unfortunately, this isn't like the thing that's going to stop weapons transfers, but what it will do is force every single member of Congress to go on record one way or the other. And I think it'll be valuable to see who in the Senate agrees to stop weapons transfers to Israel. This is like I would say the first step in a long series of steps that will eventually result in a meaningful arms embargo from the United States. Uh, a quick thing on the International Criminal Court, Karim Khan, the very lousy chair of the ICC, has been going on a press junket. So there's also a story he did with NPR, but the one I put in here was an interview with Newsweek, basically saying that like we have to respect the rule of law. If we don't respect the rule of law, then then we risk a new world war, which not wrong, frankly. But clearly this is coming from the pressure that he's been facing around the arrest warrants that he requested for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, which still have not come out. I think we were expecting them like last week or whatever, but the fact that they're still not here is a little strange. It's clear that he's facing a lot of pressure to rescind those arrest warrants, and whether that'll be successful or not, anybody's guess. Meanwhile, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was trying to sanction the ICC for soliciting those arrest warrants. That sanction is sort of on hold now. Like there's supposed to be a vote for it on Wednesday, and that vote was canceled. Everybody is blaming everybody else for that cancellation, but according to according to the chair of the committee, it's canceled because Republicans added too many amendments to it. But like both the Democrats and the Republicans on the committee are broadly okay with sanctioning the ICC, although Biden is apparently pressuring them not to sanction the ICC because he needs the ICC legitimacy for the continued military support for Ukraine. So it's a mess. And then, Thomas mentioned this at the top, but Netanyahu's speech at the United Nations today, where the overwhelming majority of delegates walked out. I read that it was the largest walkout in UN history today. I do believe it, just looking at the photos. And again, it's hard to square these two things where Netanyahu is doing this while simultaneously like causing this unimaginable death and destruction immediately after the speech. And so, I think it's easy to feel powerless in moments like this, but this is a big deal, right? Like the representatives of most of the world's countries refusing to even listen to the Prime Minister of Israel is a really big deal. Like the extent to which Israel has descended into pariah statehood in just this past year feels quite irreversible, and like the implications of that I think are quite big, even if they'll take a long time to really manifest. In the context of that, I think the ongoing credit downgrades of Israel by all of the sort of credit rating agencies is an indication of that. Moody's, which is one of the three big credit rating agencies, has downgraded Israel's credit rating again. It did it once in February, I think, and then is about to do it again, which means that Israel can't borrow money without paying high interest rates. And similar things have happened at the other credit agencies as well. Moody's was the first mover in February, so it's very likely, I think, that the other two will also be moving sometime soonish. That the impact that this has on Israel's like financial sustainability is really hard to overstate. Um, yeah, it is a big deal. Lastly, just quickly, uh, I wanted to encourage people to read this incredible article in Hammer and Hope. If you don't read Hammer and Hope, it's remarkable online magazine about the student intifada and its like incredible successes in calling out U.S. imperialism. Um, and just to note the MIT career fair that booted Lockheed Martin out by like sending a sign across the rafters saying Lockheed kills kids in Gaza, which is remarkable. And then I also just wanted to take a moment on the crazy ADL smear against Rashida Tlaib this week, where in an article for the Metro Times, I think, or Detroit News, she mentioned something around the Michigan Attorney General charging student protesters, like charging them with felonies, I think, might have been misdemeanors, saying that like this is the first time the AG has actually charged student protesters, and it feels like, it's obvious that some, like she has an agenda. Um, and Jonathan Greenblatt from the ADL, and then as a result, like sympathetic Zionist mouthpieces in the media went into this whole frenzy about how Rashida Tlaib is, like saying that the attorney general can't give objective, like objective assessment of the situation because she's Jewish, which like obviously is not what she said, and resulted in the author of the article where they inferred that from responding to Jake Tapper and other people saying, "You're lying. Like she didn't say that. That's absolutely false." And the fact that there was enough public outcry for all of them, including the ADL and the various CNN anchors like Dana Bash and Jake Tapper, to rescind and apologize for what they said, again, I would say is a really good sign that like the sort of making things up and getting away with it isn't working the way that it used to anymore. And that's a really big step. And it means that Israel's proxies here in the United States are weak compared to where they were. So I think it's really important that this was called out as pro-Israel propaganda and forced them to retract it. So if you haven't done anything on Drop the ADL, please do take a moment. I added here a link to the Drop the ADL from Schools petition, which I think is a great one. Uh, and then just to sum it all up, with the tension on Lebanon, I think Israel will probably ramp up the atrocities that it's committing in Gaza. It generally tends to get worse when people aren't paying attention. So the more attention we can continue to pay to Gaza, the better, particularly now as the 1 year anniversary of genocide looms. Um, the Israeli assault on Lebanon is in full swing, but is a ground invasion coming? I think we'll know in the next week or so. And in terms of how Israel is able to sort of manage these like multiple front genocides, it does all largely come down to U.S. weapon shipments, and our ability to cut or reduce them will really drastically change the trajectory of this war. And I think it's good to zoom out and reflect on the fact that Israel is in the worst position it's ever been in. Like it has never been weaker than it is right now. And it's easy, I think, to feel a sense of despair and overwhelm at the extent of violence, but we should see that as a reflection of its weakness, that it's no longer capable of achieving anything it wants without, just absolutely unprecedented levels of violence and destruction. And that also seems to be true for Israel's proxies here. So like the ADL and other Zionist organizations that are trying hard to justify this unjustifiable genocide and trying to persecute and prosecute people who are standing up against it are also weaker than they've ever been. And this is the moment, I think, to press that advantage. Some upcoming events. I put a couple in here, including the ongoing mayoral candidate meet and greets. There's another one this Wednesday with Asha Safai and a Healthcare Workers for Palestine event tomorrow in Berkeley. If you want to, please do check out the AROC calendar. If you want to get in, informed on our text blast system, just text PSA to 833-633-0604 and check out the PAL Media Tracker if you want to see the stories that inform this analysis. And that'll do it. Thank you all so much.
So thanks for getting us through all that, managing through it. Quick side note, I think I said this to you before we started. I think at some point during Netanyahu's speech, he makes some reference to the Abrahamic alliance with Saudi Arabia, and then they pan to Saudi, and there's nobody there. So, and on the other side note, I do think these sort of it's interesting what you said about this kind of the situation with Rashida Tlaib. I think that these sort of mini moral panics that around anti-Semitic allegations have been sort of the modus operandi since this started, the conflation of Zionism and anti-Semitism. And yeah, it's a good thing that this was sort of like in some ways nipped in the bud, but there's also sort of some fallout and damage that comes as at the cost of it. And yeah, one question I had for you just before we go is, I know that you spent some time in Lebanon, and given, even what we just said about trying to get information on whether or not Hassan Nasrallah was killed in this attack, I've noticed that a lot of the back and forth is like Israeli media claiming it, and then, it being sort of unconfirmed because it's so early in sort of the event only happened just hours ago. Um, uh, it seems like it would be obvious that the Lebanese media will be further protected than journalists in Gaza have been, obviously, who've been front and center in the attack. But Lebanon has its own sort of media, internal media system. I'm wondering if there's anything you can say about that and what you anticipate in terms of being able to get coverage of the war and get coverage of what's going on the ground.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we are going to see a very different dynamic than we saw in Gaza, right? Where broadly speaking, the media apparatus that exists in Gaza is an external one. So there isn't that much journalism infrastructure there. There's some, of course there was some, but it was relatively easy for Israel to knock it all out. Lebanon has a very robust media infrastructure. So their attempt to sort of hide the crimes that they're committing, I think will be much, much more difficult for them. Um, and like the way that information gets translated out, the number of like Western outlets that are posted in Beirut, for example, is very, very high. And that's why I think you're seeing already the sort of targeted assassination of journalists in southern Lebanon in particular, because Israel is trying already to sort of stem that. But it's not a realistic objective, I don't think, right? Like the amount of reporting that we're going to see in Lebanon is going to be way more detailed, frankly, I think, than we were able to get from Gaza.
That's my sense as well. We'll be back again next week, and it'll be just preceding a sort of a series of days of action. So we will keep you posted on whether or not there are any sort of programmatic changes that occur on our end with the anniversary and with the sort of direct actions and mobilizations that will be taking place that week. In As Sam emphasized, keep an eye on the Iraq calendar. It is one of the best places to sort of find out what's on deck. And also you can follow us all on social media. And just another final plug, just to share my screen real quick. We are as I mentioned before, we are on Spotify. So if you want to be able to follow it or send it to other folks who don't have time to sort of join the Zoom and may not sit in front of their computer to watch the rebroadcast on YouTube, you can follow us as a podcast on Spotify and have a listen there. All right, everyone. Thanks a lot. If there are any questions, we'll stick around for a few minutes just to answer those but we'll see you all next week.